Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Ayşe Süberker. Following the death of Daesh leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in a U.S. raid in northern Syria, the terror group suffered a severe blow, both to its operational capacity and symbolic presence among its followers. Many of the terror leader's core supporters still remain at large, many who hold valuable intelligence into the network's capabilities and contacts. But thanks to weeks of surveillance and coordinated raids, Turkish authorities were able to capture several key members of Baghdadi's inner circle. Chief among them were his older sister and brother-in-law, and more than a dozen Daesh members, including a senior figure who designed bombs. One of Baghdadi's wives and child are already in Turkish custody. But there is still the lingering question of what to do with the thousands of foreign Daesh prisoners in Syria whose legal status remains unclear. Turkey and the US have called on countries, many of them in Europe, to take back their citizens. But how will this transfer occur? And is Europe willing to take them back? And joining me now is David Lowe, a senior research fellow at Leeds Beckett University, who specializes in security issues and criminal law, and Kivanc Ulusoy, who is a professor at international relations at Istanbul University. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you here. After the killing of Daesh leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi by U.S. forces in Idlib, Turkey also stepped up its operations inside and outside of Turkey. And President Erdogan just recently announced that one of his wife's sister, brother-in-law, and a prominent bomb maker were under Turkish custody. David, how significant is this, and how much of an intelligence assets are family members, you think?
It's significant because actually tracing al-Baghdadi has been important because he's been a target for some time. So that's significant, but don't think that's the end of Daesh. There'll be a new leader. But it's significant in, as you said, family members. You look at the operations run by US forces. In the short term, the intelligence they got from electronic communications and from those who they captured, as long as it will provided that they actually pass on information, will be vital in the short term. But I think
what kind of intelligence they can get from them?
Well, it'd be looking at any operations they've been planning, any support systems they've got, any contacts globally. It's quite vast when you start to put it down. There's all sorts of really good source of information, but it's like anything else with any organization like Daesh or any other terrorist organization, they can quickly move and change their situation.
Okay, so Kivanc, what do you think will happen to those people? I mean, who has jurisdiction over them?
So there is a deep moral and legal issue here, but there has been a new and widespread literature on what to do with these kind of people caught after a war on terrorism, and how
this
to
is something
end the war.
New to the literature, right?
Ending the war has not been a new issue. Since the end of the Second World War, there has been a variety of cases, new issues, starting from the Nuremberg trials, for instance. Yeah, you see, this is, I think, can be regarded in this context. It's how to end a war against terrorism, how to end a war against Daesh. So this is a war law, and International Criminal Court is the primarily responsible institutions for these kind of people.
These people are high-profile people, but we all know that there are thousands of other Daesh fighters in Syria. Turkey hosts some 700 of it and wants them to be repatriated. But Europe seems quite reluctant. David, does Europe have a coherent policy?
I would say no.
Why?
Not overall. Well, the UK, for example, has different legal provisions dealing with this situation than other states. So it isn't as though the EU, and I've got to say that because in January, the UK will no longer be in the EU, or you never know. The EU has not brought out any of its own legislation to deal with this, and it's very reluctant to get involved with criminal or terrorist legislation because that's still got some sovereignty for those member states. So it's not coherent, but there are similarities. I know other states are reluctant to bring them back on similar reasons why the UK is legislated. They could pose a threat They should be tried in the areas where they've committed the crimes. It's very similar reasons why they're not being allowed back, certainly to Europe and certainly, as I know, to the UK.
Okay, but recently a German court ruled that once a Daesh affiliate mother with 3 children must be brought back from northern Syria. So do you think that could set an example for other European countries like Britain and Belgium?
I think it's a real and strong example to be considered by the rest of the European Union members. But we should see how the other member states have their own legal provisions in regards to their citizens in committing crimes in other countries, which in the case, which we know in the case of Syria. So this is a serious, I think, an important innovation in this regard, which is somehow new, as I underlined.
So what are their rights under international law?
International law is a very loose term. It's when you go across the UN, you look at UN conventions and that, it's more of a protocol really. It can be a toothless tiger at times, unless we actually get people to the International Criminal Court in The Hague and start hearing like we saw in, say, the Yugoslav civil war, things like that. But just to add to that, I know in the UK there have been women and children who've come back from Syria in the past, and they've been dealt with in a family court. So they have been allowed, where I think there's been evidence that they've not been involved. In other words, they were duped going out, but they're trying to get back. I think the issue is those who have actually been active, and Shamina Begum is a good example of why the UK is digging their heels in with her. There's evidence that she was part of that Sharia police and things like that. So I think it's each case on its merits. And I think some will be allowed back.
Is she in the non-combatant category? Because there is also a discussion about what's going to happen to non-combatants and how to prove that they didn't actually fight over there.
Yeah, I think this is what I'm saying. We have in the UK had certainly women and children come back. And there have been some males who've come back. I know some who went out early on and came back straight away, admitted what they did. They went on what we call the Prevent programme to try and de-radicalise them. But this is the situation. I think it's each case on its merits. But the ones I think who are been out there and were fighting till the end, they were pretty hardcore.
Yeah, some European governments say prisons are often an incubator for radicalization. It's a danger. They affect the other ones, and they get out more radicalized when they're released. So, are they a really serious threat, as some European countries claim, Kivanc?
Actually, I should add something to David's comments, because as you know, Trump's decision to get out of Syria was principally because of this tackling this serious issue, and he simply said that he doesn't want to deal in the next 50 years with the cost of cost of legal problems that these people would cost to them. So this is a serious thing, and I think this has been previously consulted by the governments, mainly the European governments, who has their citizens as terrorists there in
when
Syria.
they're repatriated, do you think they'll still pose a risk to the European public? I think Britain says
actually,
this a lot.
This is true. This is true. Most of the prisons have been the hotbeds of these radicalization, terrorism. They get to organize there. But what to do with them? Can they release them and organize them outside of the prison? So this is
send them maybe to rehab. No, it doesn't work. Sending them to rehab doesn't work.
Well, we have what we call a prevent strategy, which is trying to help those who are vulnerable who are being drawn towards terrorism. And you're right, prison, and for a long time UK prisons have been a recruiting ground for Islamist inspired terrorists, but also we've also got issues with far right. We've had issues with Irish Republicans, dissident Republicans who are outlawed, but they've had converts. They've had like white Christian-born males who've been converted because it's that sense of belonging. So there is that to consider, not just in this region, but even in the European states if they go back.
So where do you think Turkey stands in this respect? I mean, now Turkey detains about 800 foreign Daesh fighters and says, I can't bear them anymore. Europe has to take them back. So what do you make of it?
One thing I should again add in this context is that, those Daesh prisoners or the terrorists who are put to prison, they should know that the war is over. So if they think that the war is not over in Syria or in Iraq, so they will have always this idea of coming back and doing the same thing. So I think apart from dealing with their psychology and rehabilitation, or what to do with them, the governments also should do something on the ground to end completely the war and give them the sense that they were defeated.
Yeah, if we get back to our question, because we're running out of time.
Yes, I know.
Where do you think Turkey stands in this
I think
respect?
Turkey, from a Turkish point of view, I think it strengthens the hands of Turkey vis-à-vis the European Union. And it requires the European Union countries to be, more reasonable towards Turkey, handling this very difficult issue and having this hot potato at hand.
Yeah, David, although your country is no more a member of the European Union,
we still are.
still are. But could this dispute over taking these people back will hurt already strained relations between Turkey and the European Union? What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think I'll try and end on a positive here.
Okay.
Depends on the general election, which party wins, but as if the polls are right, we will be out in January.
Okay.
I know historically the UK and Turkey have been allies for many, many years. There is an opportunity for the UK, separate from the other 27 member states, to have some agreement with Turkey. I understand Turkey's position. I understand Operation Peace Spring. We had recently a YPG fighter who was from my area, but he was convicted because he was trained by the PKK, the YPG sent to the PKK. They are a prescribed terrorist organisation. PKK thrown no threat to the UK, but we've got them prescribed because of our allegiance to Turkey. So there is hope.
Okay, there's hope, you say. Okay, we're out of time, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk. Appreciate it a lot. Across Europe, anti-immigrant and xenophobic sentiments have been on the rise. But in Austria, one particular case occurred that raised alarms among the country's citizens with Turkish roots. After the names of more than 90,000 Austrians of Turkish descent was made public by a far-right party, questions were being asked if this was a deliberate attempt to smear that community and raise doubts about their loyalty. Our correspondent, Yunus Paksoy, traveled to Vienna to learn more about their legal battle.
A mysterious list with tens of thousands of names upends an entire community. The far-right Austrian Freedom Party circulated the list, which contained the alleged names of Turks who were suspected of having dual citizenship, which is illegal under Austrian law. For more than a year, tens of thousands of Austrians with Turkish roots lived under a cloud of suspicion, fearing their citizenship would be stripped.
This is a list whose origin and sources are unknown. Who created this list? When was this list created and for what purpose was this list created? Not a single answer at all. It's an Excel chart where there is a high possibility for manipulation. The Austrian Federal Criminal Police said there are no answers to these questions. Even the Freedom Party itself that circulated this list could not answer these questions.
Following a legal case filed against the state, the Constitutional Court delivered a judgment last December that set a precedent, halting the process of stripping people of their Austrian citizenship. The Turkish community won the legal battle, but the case is having further implications. Many of those involved feel alienated by the Austrian state and are worried about their future in the country. Despite the legal victory, people here tell us they were unfairly targeted and that suspicions against them remain.
Diese Listen könnten von überall stammen.
This list could have originated from anywhere. I could have written a list and incriminated some people, threatening their existence. It doesn't reflect our democracy or rule of law. Such shady lists should not be sufficient to destroy people's existence and their future.
Yilmaz says he took on the fight at a time people felt abandoned.
Ich habe eines gesehen.
I have seen one thing. I used to be very naive and think that politics is always there for the people. But in this case, I have seen that it was the opposite and people have been left completely alone. From the legal perspective, I have learned that fighting to the very end is always worthwhile. In football, you have to give your all to the last second. I do that with my job, and in this case, it was by all means worth it.
Das hat sich in dem Fall jedenfalls gelohnt.
Austria has seen a recent rise in support for populist parties that have made xenophobic statements.
Islam is not part of our culture. It is not part of our history, and it never will be.
A recent study by the University of Salzburg shows that almost half of Austrians want Muslim rights to be restricted. And around 80% said Muslim communities should be watched more closely.
Wir sind nicht Teil dieser Gesellschaft.
We are not part of this society. We are the society. We work here, pay our taxes here, our children go to school here. We are already right in the epicenter of life here. Then right-wing extremists come and try to exploit such things to intimidate people. I find it sad.
Many Austrians of Turkish descent say they feel lost, unsure whether the rising tide of right-wing extremism will pass or only grow stronger. It's a prospect that has left them uncertain about their future. Yunus Paksoy, Straight Talk.
And joining me now is Farid Hafez, who is a researcher at the University of Salzburg and Georgetown University's Bridge Initiative. He is also the editor of the Islamophobia Studies Yearbook. And by Cigdem Nas, who is an associate professor at Yildiz Technical University, who specializes on the EU. Welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you here. As we've seen in the package, tens of thousands of Austrians with Turkish roots now feel uneasy because of this mysterious list circulated by the far-right Austrian party. Farid, I want to start with you, since your first book published was Islamophobia in Austria, right? What is the current mood in the country now?
Well, I think it has worsened, definitely. I mean, if I remember back in the days, 2009, when I first published this book, you know, when you speak about politics, it's still, at that time, it was the far right that was mainly the major force of Islamophobia in the political space. Mm-hmm. Today, that has changed completely. I mean, not only that the centrist right political party at the moment under the leadership of Sebastian Kurz is, I would say, one of the driving forces of anti-Muslim legislation in Austria. Also, if you look to the other opposition parties, even on the left side, which supposedly should be much more anti-racist, they are buying a lot into these narratives.
Why?
Well, I think there is a fear. People are not brave enough to stand for certain positions, and I think there is a hegemony of anti-Muslim discourses. So the question is like, will you win or lose voters? And I think the current calculation on behalf of so many political parties is you can only lose by supporting the Muslims' rights for religious freedom. So that's why they are not doing it.
They've been part of this community and country for half a century, let's
Well,
say.
absolutely, but on the other side, or at the same time, they have been part of the working class poor, right? So they are not really represented in the parliaments, etc. They don't have really a voice that is heard by so many. So they can be ignored much easier.
Yeah. So Cigdem, on the EU side, what should be done to tackle with this Islamophobia problem? More security measures for places of worship for Muslims, let's say, or the judicial and political recognition by the EU institutions of Islamophobia as racism?
Yeah, I think it has two dimensions, maybe. We can look at the EU's approach. One is, of course, the security dimension, especially to fight against crimes, radical violence, and crimes against minorities and other Muslim groups. And the other is rights-based, mostly any sort of prohibition of discrimination against these. And it is also part of the fundamental charter of human rights, which the EU is also abides by. But I think Islamophobia is mostly viewed or categorized under the context of xenophobia, and it's mostly some kind of discrimination against minorities. Maybe the EU can see this issue as a separate issue among the migrant populations in the European Union and take more proactive action. But usually this area of policy is mostly left to the prerogatives of the member states. So each member state may have different policies, and the EU's approach is mostly complementary. So they try to provide some guidelines, for example, to migrant integration and to also integrate the security measures in the Schengen area. So I think creating awareness among the public that maybe discrimination or the use of some derogatory language in the media, especially fighting against disinformation in social media.
Is it working?
Yeah, it's very difficult, of course, to control these issues, but maybe creating awareness, especially in the education system, can be, I think, important.
Okay. So Farid, could you tell us about this latest Islamophobia report, which you co-authored, and you've been publishing it since 2015, but I think it is important to mention that the European Union is also funding this research for the first time. So what have you found so far?
Well, I mean, there are general trends which are ongoing, but let's say for the year of 2018, there are two things that I would say are very special observations. Okay. One thing is that in several countries, member states of the European Union, we had far-right political parties in power. And especially Austria, where I come from, we saw what that means in reality. So we had a number of anti-Muslim legislations being implemented, from the hijab ban in kindergarten, in primary school, the closing down of mosques, which, thanks God, the Viennese Court of Administration ruled being illegal. But still, I mean, the political support was there, not only from the governing parties, but even from the opposition parties, with no exception, right? So we saw what that means in the reality of Muslim people's life. The other observation that we made, which is, I think, a much more problematic one, is the rise of violent attacks on behalf of people who are inspired by right-wing anti-Muslim ideology. So, for instance, to give just one example, I mean, just recently this year in spring, we had Walter Lübcke, a Christian Democratic governing person, in Germany, who was killed in his private home, right, from outside. There was a network called Hannibal, which published a list of more than 20,000 people's names who are pro-immigration that should be attacked. And these people who are part of these terrorist networks, they are supposedly people who are connected or former officials from the Ministry of Defense and police apparatus. So that's a dangerous thing we are not only seeing in Germany, in Sweden, in France, in many countries. Obviously, the public discourse is not so much there.
So what do you suggest should be done?
Well, what has to be done, I think, and I think also European politicians will realize that the mainstreaming of this anti-Muslim ideology, which is part of a larger racist worldview, that has to be tackled, right? So if we let it go like that, and it becomes so normal, and we see, I mean, there are many polls asking people, like recently at the University of Salzburg, a sociologist, a colleague of mine did a poll where he saw like an increasing number of people, a majority of 80% would like to observe Muslim institutions. So where does this come from? That comes from the political discourse. It does not come from the mind of the people that they would just invent such an initiative. No, it is from a political discourse. And I think here...
and politicians just approve this discourse for the sake of their political careers?
Right, absolutely.
Okay. So Cigdem, Turkey and the European Union had this refugee agreement. We had some troubles from both sides. Do you believe with the start of this new operations, with the latest, let's say, the latest developments in Syria, do you believe the Europeans are fearful of a new influx of refugees, and what should be done in this respect?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, that's a major issue for the European Union, because back in 2015 and 2016, when a lot of Syrians went to the European Union through the Eastern Mediterranean and the Balkans route, and that caused a lot of problem in terms of the management of migration in the EU. We have seen that some of the member states reintroduced border controls in the Schengen area. In Germany, for example, which was maybe the country that received the largest number of Syrians in the EU, it triggered the rise of the Alternative für Deutschland. It created a lot of political problems for the Chancellor Merkel. So I think they want to avoid it at all costs. And of course, they depend on Turkey actually to prevent any sort of irregular migration from Syria and other countries in the East to the European Union. It's a major issue, I think.
And I believe it won't get any better soon with the latest findings you have. I'm afraid we're out of time, Cigdem. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Ayşe Süberkaş. If you've got any comments, do share them with us on Twitter with the hashtag Straight Talk. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.